From Black Plague to burning, what death was really like in the Middle Ages? What do you think about when you hear the word death? Your own mortality? Maybe your pet's recent passing? Or perhaps that time your favorite character bit the big one in a season finale? While today we may have the luxury of editing out death and dying in our films, those medieval folk knew all too well what death really meant. Now, if you've ever wondered how death played a role in their lives, we're here to help. Keep watching to find out the most frightening details about life, death, and everything in between during the Middle Ages. 1. Death was constant and close. During the Middle Ages, life expectancy was somewhere between 30 and 40 years. However, this statistic doesn't tell the whole story because many people did not live anywhere near that long. In fact, around half of all children would die before their 5th birthday. So death was something that everyone was intimately familiar with. It seemed inescapable. But why did so many children die? Well, it wasn't just bad parenting. Instead, it was common for entire communities to perish due to plagues, famine, war, and poor hygiene. This is why death was such a normal occurrence for medieval people. It was a public event, a shared experience which affected everyone. Speaking of plagues, let's take a closer look at one of the deadliest outbreaks, shall we? The Black Death, which ran rampant across Europe between 1347 and 1351, was particularly brutal. It's estimated that over 25 million people perished. And with death striking down people indiscriminately, there was little anyone could do to stop it. And speaking of things that couldn't be stopped, stay tuned until the end of this video to find out about some fears that kept medieval people up at night. But first, let's take a look at these superstitions. 2. Diseases were brutal and unstoppable. The Black Death is only one example of the terrible diseases that ravaged medieval society. Once illness struck, it spread fast, and it didn't matter how much medieval folk tried to stop it. It would move from person to person. Urban crowding and a lack of basic medical knowledge meant that diseases spread like wildfire. For example, an infected person living in a cramped medieval town would unknowingly infect others through close proximity. Since they didn't know about bacteria or viruses, they wouldn't realize the importance of hand washing. And with open sewers and rubbish lying around, conditions were ripe for infection. Another deadly disease was leprosy, which affected people across social classes. We can learn more about how serious the illness was by looking at the efforts made to isolate those who had contracted it. For instance, lepers were banished from towns and forced to live outside. Some even built their own communities. Smallpox, tuberculosis, and dysentery were also prevalent. And while some diseases could lay dormant in a person for years, others showed symptoms right away, including fever, weakness, and aching bones. For those unlucky enough to contract the plague, however, symptoms could include black spots, aches and pains, and eventually death. And while these illnesses were all unpleasant, next we'll tell you about an ailment that was sure to hurt. 3. Executions were public spectacles. While we might think that capital punishment is barbaric, during the Middle Ages, it was simply part of daily life. Men, women, and even children could be put to death for crimes ranging from murder to heresy. And this wasn't done behind closed doors. Executions were public spectacles, and punishments were designed to be terrifying. This was done so that crowds watching could learn from the condemned person's mistakes and be deterred from committing similar crimes, otherwise known as deterrence through spectacle. So, what kinds of punishments were used during this time? One of the most common methods of execution was beheading, usually carried out by a skilled executioner using a large sword or axe. Hanging was another popular method, sometimes being used for those convicted of less severe crimes, but could also result in death. Other times, the condemned would be burned alive, boiled, or quartered. Drawing and quartering was the ultimate humiliation and reserved for those considered traitors, such as Benedict Arnold, who betrayed the Americans in the Revolutionary War. Victims were tied to a horse and dragged through the streets before being cut into 4 pieces. 4. Burial practices were class-based. As you might have noticed, death was everywhere in medieval society and inevitably had to be dealt with. This task fell upon the shoulders of family members who had to decide how to bury their loved ones. Depending on their social class, the wealthy dead could afford a stone tomb within a church or even their own chapel. Others were interred in the crypts below the church. Meanwhile, the poor didn't have such luxuries. They were typically buried in shallow graves en masse. This overcrowding created an interesting side effect. Instead of saving room for new burials, gravediggers would exhume old bodies and throw them up in sheds or mass. Eventually, this practice became so common that specialized buildings called ossuaries or bone churches were constructed. These buildings were specifically designed to hold the bones of the deceased and would sometimes become tourist attractions themselves. Speaking of religious influence, stay tuned to the end of this video to find out about one fear that united medieval people across the social classes. But first, let's talk about the artwork created during the Middle Ages. 5. Fear of the afterlife shaped daily life. Medieval people were deeply religious and believed strongly in the afterlife. The church taught that following God would lead to heaven and salvation, while those who rejected the church teachings would go to hell for eternal torment. Another place that souls could end up was purgatory, an in-between place where sinners could be cleansed before entering heaven. In order to avoid ending up in hell, medieval folk took great care to live according to God's teachings. This was especially true towards the end of life. Many wanted to ensure that they died peacefully after confessing any sins and receiving the last sacraments. Paintings and engravings from the time period depict hell as a frightening place filled with fire, demons, and pain. Those who died without getting their affairs in order could suffer endlessly. With such a powerful message, it's no wonder that the fear of hell kept medieval people in check. And while the threat of hell was strong, other fears loomed. 6. Superstitions and rituals surrounded death, covering mirrors, stopping clocks, opening windows. These actions might seem strange to us now, but they were once commonplace during the Middle Ages. That's because folk beliefs held that certain actions could impact the soul of the recently deceased. Some went as far as to say that certain objects could bring bad luck to those who encountered them. Ghosts were also a source of fear and fascination for medieval folk, and it was believed that spirits could linger on earth for decades. Omens and curses were also common, and some people even hired professional curse breakers to come to their aid. Amulets, prayers, and magic were all used to ward off evil spirits and keep death and disease away. So whether you were dealing with a ghost, a curse, or trying to prevent death itself, it was best to be prepared. And speaking of being prepared, let's take a look at the art of dying. 7. Dying well was a spiritual goal. Dying well was seen as a moral duty for Christians during the Middle Ages. This practice, known as the ars moriendi, or the art of dying, dictated that a good death involved confession, prayer, and grace. These last rites were essential to prepare the soul for judgment. When death was imminent, family and clergy would gather together and pray. This final interaction ensured that the soul would be ready for its journey. A good death was peaceful, free of sin, and surrounded by the clergy. To the contrary, a bad death was noisy, painful, and full of despair. Those who died suddenly or violently were thought to have a harder time reaching salvation. However, no matter how someone died, there was always hope for redemption. Even unbaptized babies were thought to be saved if their parents practiced Christianity. While death and dying were inevitable, medieval people strove to make the process as pleasant as possible. While some deaths were peaceful, others were anything but. But as you can see, death was a part of everyday life and influenced everything from art to burial practices. So, what was your favorite fact from this list? Let us know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to follow for more medieval content. Thanks for watching.